wrote a book called Blockchain in Law in 2018. She's a researcher at CNRS in Paris, and she's visiting the Berkeley Klein Center this year. And thankfully, she's also here in Berkeley for these next 2 months. So let's welcome Primavera.
Thank you. Yes, it's actually the first time that I do a presentation in front of my chat.
Is the mic working?
I don't know. Is it working? Yes, so I'm actually very eager to hear the feedback because usually I always get like the feedback from mostly lawyers. So I'm very interested in the feedback from computer scientists.
Is the mic working?
I think so. Yeah.
Can you move it up maybe higher? Here.
Is it working? Okay. So, so with this presentation, I will explain how the distinctive characteristics of blockchain technology make it simultaneously a very powerful regulation technology, so a tool to actually implement specific regulatory objectives, but also a powerful tool for potentially trying to escape regulation. And so first I will describe the regulatory challenges that are raised by blockchain technology, mostly due to the fact that there is no centralized authority to regulate. And then we will look into the governance of blockchain network in order to see how the different modalities of governance can actually contribute to regulating or influencing the operations and the activities on those networks, both from the inside and the outside of the network. And then at the end, we're then going to see the extent to which blockchain technology could potentially be used as this regulatory technology in order to rely on technological guarantees in order to achieve policy objectives. And so in 1995, Joel Redenberg from Princeton University introduced the notion of lex informatica to express the idea that on the internet, code is increasingly being used as a way to regulate individual behavior. And so code is law because the code actually assumes the same function of the law. Even though, of course, this code remains under the control of specific intermediary operators, which are themselves subject to the rule of the law. And then on a blockchain, code is also being used to regulate individual behaviors. The difference is that this time, given the specificities of this blockchain code, the technology can be used to establish a series of self-executable rules, which can, to some extent, ignore the rules of the law. And so in this sense, the only law that actually matters in these systems is the code that has been deployed on the blockchain. And so this has two important implications. One is that blockchain technology reduces the needs for intermediaries or trusted authority because it shifts the trust away from those centralized operators towards the underlying technology. And this means that to the extent that we can actually trust the underlying technology, then we might no longer need to trust anyone else. And then we will see later what does it mean to trust blockchain technology. And then the other is that it creates new possibilities for increasing the automation and the autonomy of those blockchain-based systems. Because once a particular piece of code has been deployed on the blockchain, then it can operate autonomously and independently of the will of the parties that have deployed it. And so this leads to potential conflicts between the rule of law and the rule of code. And so we will analyze what is the interplay between those two types of regulation, so regulation by code and regulation by law, and to which extent one is potentially overtaking the other. So can blockchain-based systems be forced to comply with the law, or can they instead be used to escape existing regulatory frameworks to the extent that they operate within their own separate technical framework? And so if we back up a little and we look at the narratives from the early internet days, then we might remember some of the claims of the early internet pioneers like John Perry Barlow or Timothy May, who saw the cyberspace as an independent space that simply could not be regulated because government did not have the right or the capacity to exert their sovereignty over it. But of course, those visions did not really materialize like those pioneers had hoped, because as soon as the opportunity of the internet began to be understood by established players, then the architecture of the internet network slowly started to evolve into an increasingly concentrated system, which is controlled by a few incumbents. And so in a few years, the internet, which was initially seen as a powerful tool to promote individual freedom and autonomy, has eventually become a tool of surveillance and control. So in fact, after the initial fear of,
So the fact that it became centralized, I mean, even if there weren't 5 big companies, still government would want to use its sovereignty, right? Even if it
yes,
was...
so that's the point. So initially there was this discussion within like the academic field about Lex Informatica, which was it's very hard to regulate the cyberspace. But in fact, because of the intermediaries that are establishing themselves on the internet, then it became quite obvious that it's actually easy to regulate the internet. Instead of trying to regulate every individual user, we can regulate the architecture. We can regulate the code that those operators are actually deploying on the internet. So instead of having this direct regulation, we have an indirect regulation via the technology. But the reason we can do that is because we have those intermediary operators that we can identify and that we have sovereignty over. So this is the pathetic duct theory of Lawrence Lessig from Harvard University, which basically show how individuals are constantly being regulated by those 4 different forces, so market, law, social norms, and architecture or code in the digital world, and how on the internet, code has become this kind of privileged force used to influence and regulate the behavior of internet users, and then the law simply indirectly regulates user by regulating the technology. Now the question is whether the same solution can actually apply to a blockchain-based system. And the problem here is that with a blockchain, because of the disintermediation and decentralization that it implies, then we lose this most effective tool of regulation, which are the intermediary operators. And so if we don't have those intermediary operators anymore, then it becomes much harder to leverage the traditional means of regulation that were available on the internet, because we can no longer easily identify what is the object of this regulation. And so when we were talking about the regulation of the internet, then people introduced the notion of unregulability to highlight the complexity inherent in the regulation of such a decentralized and transnational network like the internet. And then with the blockchain, then some people now are referring to platforms as being illegal in the sense that they operate outside of the purview of the law. And the idea is that a blockchain implements its own technical framework that operates according to its own rules and that cannot therefore be touched or affected by the law. And so we can already see a few applications of blockchain technology that are in direct conflict with existing regulations. And so many of those applications leverage the pseudonymity of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies in order to facilitate money laundering, in order to set up some decentralized marketplaces for the trading of illicit goods. And then more recently, we also found that the tamper-resistant feature and the immutability of a blockchain system can actually lead to the storage of illicit content, like copyright infringement or hate speech, or even links to child pornography, and also potentially prevent the exercise of specific rights that require the deletion of content, such as the GDPR right to be forgotten. And so this distinction between the rule of law and the rule of code is actually quite apparent in the context of property. So property rights are defined by the law, and therefore they can be taken away by the law. So if I've acquired a particular piece of property in a way that appears to be illegitimate, then a court or a judge can declare that I'm not the legitimate owner of this property and potentially seize it from me. And when we move into a blockchain-based system, then we have this concept of blockchain-based property or cryptographic assets that do not actually follow the same rules, because the ownership of those assets is not defined by the law but rather by the code, and therefore it can only be taken away by the code. And so even if I illegitimately acquire a Bitcoin, then regardless of what the law says, then no one actually has the technical capacity of seizing it from me unless the code actually provides for that. And then the same applies in the field of contracts. So traditional legal contracts are created according to specific rules which are defined by contract law, and they are meant to create binding agreements between two parties. And those contracts need to be enforced by a third-party authority which has to interpret the wording of the contract in order to understand what is the actual intentions of the parties. And then in the context of a smart contract, the actual contractual relationship is defined by the code of the smart contract, and it no longer requires any third-party enforcement, because the provision of the smart contract will be automatically enforced by the technology itself. And yet the problem here is that the technology obviously cannot account of the real intentions of the parties, but only will look at the actual wording of the code. And so perhaps the best example of this distinction between the rule of law and the rule of code has been provided by the DAO. So I think I don't need to explain exactly what happened, but basically the DAO was this decentralized investment fund that was deployed as a smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain back in 2016. And the idea was that it was collectively managed by the investor themselves, who could participate in the decision-making as to which project to invest in, depending on the amount of money that they had invested into the fund. And so because there was no centralized authority, every interaction with the DAO was done via a smart contract transaction. And so one day someone identified a vulnerability in the code of the smart contract governing the DAO and exploited it in order to take away $60 million. And so this raised a very heated debate within the Ethereum community concerning whether or not this action actually qualified as a theft, in the sense that it actually went counter to the original intention of the parties, or whether it could be regarded as a legitimate action insofar as it actually did not go counter to the wording of the code of the smart contract. And so even though most people will probably agree that it qualified as a theft, the transaction could not be reverted as it could have done in the traditional financial system, because there was no central authority. Then one could not rely on the traditional legal system in order to enforce the law. And so in this case, the autonomy or the immutability of the blockchain code actually made it impossible for any third-party authority to seize the stolen assets. And so the only way to remediate this theft was for the Ethereum community to take a coordinated action in order to actually change the underlying protocol of the Ethereum blockchain. And so this essentially shows that no blockchain is an island, in the sense that a blockchain does not subsist on its own, but it exists between a much larger ecosystem. And so even if we cannot rely on the traditional means of regulation, as blockchain technology becomes more widely and adopted as an infrastructure, then intervention will become necessary.
In the DAO case, one could say that the arbitrator was the market because it led to a right of fork.
Yes, I'm going to go to that. So basically, if we cannot rely on these traditional means of regulation, then what are the new avenues for intervention? And so, well, first of all, there is the traditional intermediaries. So because blockchain systems are actually built on top of the existing internet, they can therefore be affected by those traditional intermediaries like ISP, which could apply packet filtering or other technique to limit the access to a blockchain network. At the same time, there is also the need for people to use a variety of intermediaries like search engines or social networks in order to discover the application that might rely on a blockchain. And then those intermediaries have the possibility to somehow limit the adoption of those applications, but making them more difficult to find. And we have seen this already in the case of both Google and Facebook, which began to censor some activity related to blockchain, especially in the context of token sales. And then we also see the emergence of new intermediaries. So we have cryptocurrencies exchanges used to trade blockchain-based assets. And so even though a blockchain-based network is itself decentralized, and even though there is a growing number of decentralized exchanges that are being built, the majority of cryptocurrency exchanges are actually operated by large companies incorporated in a particular jurisdiction, and therefore they are obliged to comply with the law of those jurisdictions, especially with regard to know your customer and anti-money laundering regulation. And then we have the miners and the mining pools, which are the transaction processor. And so we have seen over the past years this growing consolidation of a few large mining pools, which have become identifiable intermediaries and which could potentially be regulated. And we're starting to see this type of regulation coming up both in China and in the US, which are actually attempting to restrict the activities of some of the mining pools, either by increasing the tax or by actually limiting the quantity of energy that is provided.
So probably I should have asked earlier, but can you explain exactly what you mean by intermediaries? Because you use the term.
Yeah, I mean, basically intermediaries those are the actors that you can identify and that are providing access or providing a service towards the network. So you have like, the ISP is an intermediary to access the internet. Those are intermediaries to access information. And then cryptocurrency exchange are an intermediary to the extent that we need to use them in order to exchange cryptocurrency in fiat. And then the mining pool, maybe the mining pool is not a perfect intermediary, but it's a large identifiable intermediary that can be regulated. Yeah. Yeah, I don't maybe.
The term intermediaries has been used with a different meaning since the late 90s. Maybe this is what confused me. But
It's basically who are those new types of operators that are emerging around the network, which becomes gateways and which you depend upon them in order to either access the network or access a particular service related to the network.
Question? So in the financial system, this would be, for example, my credit card company that can revert payment.
Yeah.
Details were stolen, right?
Yeah.
I think that the miners are the last line of defense for the blockchain and cryptocurrency world. And what you can do, there are several projects that do that, that allow the users to choose their own intermediaries. So at the time we proposed to do it with Bitcoin vaults that allow you to cancel a payment. There is the Hydra project from Phil Dan and company at Cornell Tech that allows to overcome bugs before it reaches the point where you have to go to the miners. You can choose your own intermediaries, and in case of major failure, you can tell them something fishy is going on here. This group can decide to revert it.
So this is creating new cluster of intermediation that people can choose. Absolutely. But same thing with, I mean, those are always voluntary intermediaries. You can get to choose them. Now, except for the regulation of new or established intermediaries, there is also other types of possible interventions. One is criminalizing end users, in the sense that governments can actually prevent people from accessing or interacting with a particular blockchain or interacting with a particular illicit smart contract. Of course, it's very hard to identify who the users are because of the pseudonymous nature of this network. And it is also oftentimes not such a good idea to target directly the end users, as we have seen in the past with like the copyright wars against piracy, mostly because those oftentimes translate into extremely draconian type of regulations, which very often go and impinge upon the privacy of individuals and require this kind of like surveillance in order to be able to identify every single action done by the end users. And then the other alternative is to actually impose liability on software developers or hardware manufacturers. And I guess we will have Angela Walsh that will focus on this specifically. And here the idea is that government could force developers to incorporate specific backdoors or kill switches. And again, we have seen this already attempted in the past with the US and the wars about cryptography with the Clipper chip, where government was trying to regulate the manufacturer of hardware device in order to incorporate a particular backdoor, obviously creating the risk of vulnerabilities.
I was just curious why hardware and software developers are not intermediaries. Is there an obvious explanation there?
Yeah, because they are not necessarily they are providing a device, but then the device can be used by anyone on their own local level. It's not, an intermediary is something that exists in the middle and is the gateway. So
but they are providing, they're providing tools which are touching the data. So I guess I see your point, but
I mean, it's like saying the computer, the Apple is an intermediary because it creates computer, as opposed to Google being an intermediary because I need to rely on Google to access specific services.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So now comes another type of possible regulatory lever, which is market-based regulation. So, of course, there is the obvious 51% attack, which is probably very unlikely because it will currently require several billions of dollars in order to attack one of those networks, but potentially it is definitely within the reach of state-based actors. Alternatively, there is the possibility of trying to manipulate the market by trying to affect the value of a particular cryptocurrency in order to create instability and potentially dissuade the use of the related blockchain. And then there is this more emergent discussion around network neutrality or blockchain neutrality. Basically because there are those specific actors within the network. On the one hand, we have miners, which to some extent can be analogized with internet service provider in the sense that they are these transaction processors that register transaction in a block. And they are, in theory, completely oblivious as to the type, the source, or the destination of the transaction that they are processing, because they essentially only care about block reward and transaction fee. But it is quite possible that either a government or because of external contractual agreements, then miners might be required to enforce specific rules, such as ignoring a particular type of transactions that are coming or going towards a particular account, plus preventing them to process or to build upon any block in which such a transaction has actually been incorporated. And so if it is possible to actually control over 50% of the mining power to follow those same rules, then it actually becomes possible to censor transactions without actually leaving any visibility because there is actually no protocol change. And then on the other hand, there is those supernodes, which are those actors that actually have a particular type of influence on a blockchain network. So those are exchanges, those are blockchain explorer, or custodian wallet, or basically any commercial operator that interact with a blockchain, which again have also the possibility of refusing or accepting specific transaction coming from a particular account. So they have the possibility of creating black or white list. They also have the power to accept or reject a particular protocol change in the case of a fork. And every user that actually wants to continue interacting with those actors will then follow that particular fork. And then finally, and perhaps what is one of the most effective ways of intervention or regulation of a blockchain system is social norms, in the sense that we are already seeing the influence that social norms have in the governance of specific blockchain systems. So we can see the contrast from Bitcoin, which has this collective desire of achieving almost perfect immutability, so really abiding by the code is law paradigm, versus Ethereum, which actually focus more on distributed consensus and has shown to be much more willing to modify the protocol in order to fix a particular erroneous or illegitimate transaction if this will have negative impact on the network or perhaps on society at large. And so if we go back to Lessig framework, then we can see that even though it might be more challenging on a blockchain system for the law to regulate the infrastructure of a blockchain, we can nonetheless rely on this new lever of intervention, which is social norms. And so these highlight the importance of blockchain governance, which I think will actually play a very important role in the way in which the technology will evolve. And so I will now provide a small overview of the various actors and the various forces that contribute to the governance in a blockchain system. So first of all, it is important to distinguish between the governance by the infrastructure, so what is usually called on-chain governance, which basically refers to all the rules that are backed directly into the technology and which are enforced by the technology. And here the focus is on the enforcement of the rules as opposed to on the elaboration of those rules. And then governance of the infrastructure, which is off-chain governance, which relates to the more social and institutional layers by which those rules are elaborated before they are actually embedded into the technology, as well as all the procedures that are necessary to decide how to change those rules if needed. And then for each one of those categories, we can also distinguish between endogenous rules, which are developed by the community and for the community, and exogenous rules, which are actually imposed by a third party over the community. And so initially, most of the focus was on endogenous on-chain governance, basically looking at how we can use blockchain technology to incorporate specific rules directly into the technological fabric of a particular system, whether that's through the blockchain protocol or smart contracts. And then eventually it has become more obvious that it is just as important, if not more important, to think about off-chain governance. And this includes all the social norm, institutional arrangement that actually makes it possible for the rules to evolve and to adapt to the community's needs. And so the importance of off-chain governance has been visible by two governance crises that the Ethereum community has faced. So on the one hand, the DAO hack, which actually led to the community to make an intervention in order to change the protocol to retrieve the funds. And then the other one was the parity bug, which was the exploitation of a bug in a multi-sig smart contract, which led to over $300 million worth of Ether to be frozen on the blockchain. And again, here, it created a lot of debate within the community as to whether we should change the protocol in order to release those funds. And as opposed to the DAO, which actually led to a collective intervention, in the case of this problem, then the decision was not to intervene. And so there were many discussions and many reasons why not. But one of the reasons was because while the DAO attack was done as an emergency, it was like a state of exception, doing it again would necessarily require creating an actual procedure, actually specifying and formalizing the way in which decisions need to be taken about whether or not to modify the protocol to fix a problem. And so there was this fear that if such a procedure is actually formalized, then all of a sudden there will actually be legal liability associated with it, in the sense that it will become visible that the community, and especially the people that get to decide within this procedure whether or not to change the protocol, actually have influence and have the capacity to decide whether or not to change the protocol and therefore to collect back some funds. And many of the people that were actually involved in the discussion, they actually did not want to make such a political decision because they They were used to only dealing with like technical issues. And so there was a lot of fear of actually legal liability, which led to the decision we should not intervene on this one. And so
Why would there be legal liability?
basically because if you create a procedure, so you have like in Ethereum, you have the Ethereum improvement proposal process, and you have like some proposal editors that essentially decide whether these proposals should be assessed or not, and then some people from the community, mostly like the core dev, they will decide whether or not to accept this proposal. And so in this case, by formalizing this procedure, not just for technical issue, but also for political or legal questions, then all of a sudden those people that make the decision could be possibly considered to be liable. So for instance, if I did a mistake and I lost my Ether, then I could make a proposal to, we need to change the protocol because I need to recover my Ether. And if they decide not to, but they decided to do it for other cases, then I could have a recourse against them.
Under what court? So how come it wouldn't apply to the DAO attack? Would the people who decided that not also have the similar liability?
Yes, but in that case, that's the whole point. It was a state of exception. There was urgency, so something had to be decided. And it had done in a completely informal way. Nobody really knows how the things has been decided. Now, in the case of parity, because there was no urgency, the only way you can decide is actually you need to make a process. And so as you create a process and as you formalize the governance for deciding on this question, then all of a sudden people are identified at the different levels and you know who is actually making the decisions.
So for example, the person who put the parity smart contract, probably there's like identifiability. You could probably identify in the Git exactly the person who
Yes.
put that contract. So would they be, by the same logic, wouldn't they already be liable?
That's also a possibility. I mean, we have done, we actually did, the thing is that there has not been any court, there has not been any justice, action in justice so far, so it's really hard to tell. We've done a moot court on the DAO attack, just to see, like, we took like some judges from Florida, and we pretended that some were actually suing the developer of the smart contract, and at the end, like, it was a 2 or 3 hours discussion, and at the end, the judges actually said that they could refuse to give a verdict because they just didn't understand anything. Like, it was just completely, it was so out of their mind. So yes, possibly you could sue Parity because they have done an error in there. But even if you sue them, they won't be able to pay back $300 million. So the only way you can actually get those funds back is by actually changing the infrastructure. Right, so you can always sue people, and then they will give you whatever money and damages you can get from them, but the money is actually still stuck in the blockchain. Right?
So I don't understand why it follows that there couldn't have been an informal process after the parity bug because there was no looming deadline. They could have, in the span of a few weeks, just like with DAO, decided that there was going to be 2 competing forked versions.
Even who decides?
Same people who decided, for the...
Who decides? Who decides for the DAO?
It's Vitalik, probably.
I mean, it was...
Well, Vitalik definitely did not want to decide on that. I mean, that's the problem. The DAO, it's really hard to tell who has taken the decision. No one really has taken the decision. It just happened that the network followed a particular decision.
Sure, but the exact same process that worked for the DAO could have been applied to parity. The fact that there was no deadline doesn't preclude that they could have just made some informal decision, right?
I mean, and if there had been an informal decision, probably there would have been a fork. It just didn't happen, so maybe the decision was an informal decision not to do anything, but within the actual Ethereum community, there was this discussion as to what do we do, because this is just 2 examples, but there will be many. Like, as this technology gets used more and more, it's going to happen a lot that people are doing error in the way in which they do the smart contract, and there will be some losses. And every time, you cannot just every time rely on an informal process. So either you ignore and you say, we actually don't want to have any type, whether it's formal or informal, there is just no intervention possible because it's a blockchain and it's immutable, or we actually accept the fact that intervention is possible. But if you accept the fact that intervention is possible, then obviously you need to say when intervention is possible and who is to decide when to do it.
I guess I just don't buy you say like that they can't just have an informal process every time, but they do have an informal process every time. So like you're saying something's not possible, that is exactly what they've done.
So that's what they've done with the DAO, and
Parity too, it's just
I
like,
mean, yeah, with Parity they have decided to keep this a completely informal system, and the informality of the system has led to no intervention. But they refuse to create a formalized structure because of the fear of actually showing that they do have the power, or that there are some people that do have the power to make an intervention.
I come at this from a lawyer brain, not a computer science brain, but they have to be concerned not just about legal liability, but precedential issues, as you were saying. But I also wonder, at what point does it become centralized, right? I mean, I think the trust in a decentralized system is really at risk if you're having people make these decisions at every point.
I think in some way, and that's why it's kind of weird to talk about formal and informal, in the sense that even if there is a formalized process, not everybody needs to follow. There is no coercion anyhow. So it wouldn't be, even if the Ethereum Foundation creates its own process for deciding when to intervene, but then no nodes actually accept the decision, then there is a formal process that is not actually adopted. So I don't think it can really be centralized in that sense. But if they do actually listen, then it's dangerous, because then you can actually claim that they do have power. Even though it's not a full power, because it's not a coercive power.
So I would say that they still have power, and they demonstrate it every time they do a protocol upgrade that is technical. They have whatever, it's still an informal process. It gets executed like clockwork, however. You see it in Bitcoin, for example, where no formal structure exists, yet every protocol upgrade pretty much goes through well and is agreed upon by a lot of people. So you could argue that they are liable for not reversing parity, because they can still do it. They do it for technical things. This is something that is solvable via technical means. So I'm not sure I would confer any protection on them just by...
I will say, it's an argument. The argument is, if you do something, obviously you have shown that you can do it. If you have not done anything, you don't have a proof that you could have done something, right? Now, with the improvement proposal, there is an actual formal process of how it works, but it's actually designed for technical questions, and no one at this stage, no one within the Ethereum improvement proposal actually wanted to make any decision that was not a technical decision. And some of the EIP editors actually left just because of that, because they didn't want to be involved in that process. For Bitcoin, again, they have the Bitcoin improvement proposal, and there is not always a consensus, as we have seen Bitcoin forking in many other subnetworks. So whether you can always have a formal proposal, but of course that doesn't actually mean, because there is no coercive power, that doesn't mean that the decision will actually be taken and people can fork in any direction anyways. So it's this weird type of power. It's not full power. It's you have influence, but you don't really have power.
So I want to ask you a hypothetical. Since there was some EIP editor that's identifiable that made changes for the DAO attack, let's say there's a list of people that actually were attributed to that change.
The DAO attack actually, the parity bug went through EIP, and then that's where the problem came in, because people refused. The DAO attack was done in a very urgent manner, and it went into the informal process. People tried to
check in code that there is some public. You could identify a few people that had to change code.
Yeah, of course. The core developer implemented the hard fork, and then people decided to take it.
Parity basically sue the core developers who made changes for the DAO attack under your argument that, well, they made a change to fix a bug that restored justice for the people who lost money here, so they should make a change to restore justice for the people who lost money there.
That would be a very hard argument to win. They could do it, but no, because all they do is providing a tool, and then you still need users to adopt this tool. There is no any core developer can do anything they want or not do anything they want, and Parity could have developed the solution as well. They could have proposed into their own client the solution to the parity bug. But then if no one is actually accepting that or adopting it into their own client, then it doesn't matter. So I don't think parity would have any kind of claim over the author core dev.
Okay, so I guess the distinction you make is quite subtle. It's that if there was a formal process, then there would be identifiable people that would be subjected to these type of frivolous lawsuits. But since there isn't one, and you can't even make up some argument that like the people who did it before were the same
Because
people.
you don't even know who really did it. You just know that core developer created, upgraded that.
Make a list of 5 people and, there really are 5
Yeah,
people.
but I mean, that will not be a hard win, because you will have to justify that they actually had influence, and they could prove that they actually have no power over what the user will decide to, or the miners will use to implement. It's not such an easy case.
I wonder if this is actually, I mean, we've had discussions about legalities. I just wonder if this was it's a case of your social norms. This is kind of a signal by the developers. Initially, we're putting a little bit of, with the DAO attack, they were signaling that there is some openness. We are openness to the idea of trying to put some other things in beside code as law. But then with the parity bug, they said, all right, we're just signaling decentralization is our focus. I wonder if that's a better framework. What do you think? Any comments?
Which one is the focus?
I just wondered if you had comments on this idea that it's just like the signal that people were trying to send with these decisions.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's also like, there's many reasons why this has been decided, well, why informally it has been decided not to intervene. The legal liability is one of them. The fact of not wanting to show that there is a possibility, that there is an actual process for changing, because most of the credibility of the blockchain comes from the fact that it's immutable. And if all of a sudden you start creating a process for mutability, then some people might no longer trust this blockchain, right? So there is many reasons, including whether, what does distributed consensus mean? Do we want to just, if anyone agrees, then we can change anything, or do we still have some prerogative about code is law and things like that? So the social norm of Ethereum, of course, they also don't want to show that everything can change arbitrarily by a few % part of a process. So it's a very complex decision, because on the one hand, there is a desire of creating some level of risk management if there is very drastic problems happening on the network, but at the same time you don't want it to become the decision of a few people. If there was a process, it will have to be a very complex and kind of democratic process with separation of power and all this. You basically need to recreate traditional institutions so that no one is actually liable because everyone is part of the decision, right? But because there is no governance in Ethereum at the moment that can be democratic, because we don't even know who the people are. So you cannot even can ask the users to express themselves. It's basically just miners. So it's a very complex question, whether or not and how to deal with possible mistakes in the code, and whether there is actually a possibility to create a system that will enable those to overcome specific problems without actually falling into a system that then that can no longer claim to be trustless. So basically, those cases highlight the importance of exogenous rules, but with regard to the fact that a smart contract, the operation of a smart contract can actually be affected by the underlying network, which in this case is the blockchain network. And so this guarantee of execution is actually only guaranteed to the extent that the protocol does not change. And on the other hand is also the question of all the non-technical rules from outside of the community, most importantly laws and regulation, which even if they cannot affect directly the actor and the network, they can nonetheless exert some kind of pressure over the community of people that do have influence over this network. And so basically this shows how the blockchain governance is essentially a multi-layered governance process where we have the core developers at the top, which are basically providing the possible choices, the protocol changes, that then the other participants of the network can choose from. And then at the bottom, we have the nodes, whether the miners or the validators. We can select some of the possible choices that have been offered to them, but based on what they actually want, but also based on the perception of what the other wants. Because the network is only valuable to the extent that there is actually a sufficient amount of people that agree to the same protocol. And then outside of that, we also have other type of influencers that basically try to establish this shelling point. And those are, of course, the mining pool that can aggregate the hashing power of individual miners. Those are the supernodes, cryptocurrency exchange, blockchain explorer, and so forth. And then there are the people, which can either be those charismatic leaders, which have the highest degree of credibility, or all the social media influencers, which can try and lobby for one particular change or the other. And so in terms of regulation by code, then we can see that blockchain systems do provide, at least in theory, stronger guarantees than traditional internet platforms, because there is no centralized authority that can intervene to impose a particular decision to the users. But at the same time, those systems are actually governed by a very large community of actors, which are involved in the development, in the operation, or in the maintenance of the network, and which are all trying to influence each other to adopt a particular protocol over the other, without, however, never having any possibility of coercion. And so basically, how does the governance happen? And this goes to your question. So the most popular type of blockchain governance at the moment is based on market-based governance, basically relying on market dynamics in order to coordinate individuals without any centralized authority. And so essentially, this means that we have most systems operate as a plutocracy, where the influence is based on the amount of resources, whether that's hashing power or cryptocurrency holdings, that a person can acquire. And this actually makes sense because the free market is indeed a powerful mechanism for obtaining distributed consensus. But of course, as we have seen over the years, markets can also easily be manipulated by powerful actors. And unless we do actually have an institution that can protect the competitiveness of the market, then oftentimes they evolve into an oligopolistic system. And so when we talk about the governance of blockchain technology, it is also important to distinguish between the decentralization of the infrastructure and the decentralization of power over this infrastructure. And most importantly, it is important to understand that the decentralization of the infrastructure will not necessarily lead to a decentralization of power. And in fact, it can be the contrary, because a decentralized infrastructure is oftentimes weaker than a centralized infrastructure, because there is no institution that can protect it, then it can easily be co-opted by the most powerful actors. And so when left to the invisible hands of the market, then many blockchain-based systems are likely to evolve into increasingly centralized systems, potentially with the emergence of new intermediaries operators that might progressively re-intermediate the whole system, just like it happened with the internet. And the whole thing is further exacerbated by the issue of the tyranny of structurelessness, which often emerge in communities that do not have a formalized governance structure. So in a centralized system, the hierarchical structure is transparent, so people can know who are the people in power, and the activity can be monitored so that there can be no abuses of power. There is some kind of accountability. Whereas in a decentralized system, power actually often consolidates into those invisible structures, but the underlying power dynamics are actually not apparent. There is like those invisible powers that emerge, but it's really difficult for people to understand who is actually accountable for what. And this is what happened with the DAO attack. There was people that actually had specific power and influence over the network, but it's really hard for anyone using the network to actually know how the decision was actually being made. And so the main takeaway is that governance should actually never be analyzed in a static manner, because it is essentially a dynamic process that evolves over time, and power oftentimes shifts from one place to the other. And so if the goal is to create a decentralized system with a decentralized governance, then it is oftentimes not enough to start with a level playing field, like a system where everyone starts equal, because the accumulation of resources over time will actually create decentralization of, a re-centralization of power. And so the problem is that there is actually nothing natural or spontaneous about the decentralization of power, and distributing power within a community actually requires governance and potentially regulation to ensure that the power does not concentrate into the hands of a few. And this is something that is currently lacking in most blockchain community. And if I have, do I still have 2 minutes? Because this is like, I just want to spend a few minutes on this one, because this is actually the thing that I'm the most interested to share and to receive feedback on. And it's the potential of actually using blockchain technology as a regulatory technology. And so basically we shift from the idea of code is law, where we have private actors which are using the technology to regulate behavior, to the idea of code as law, where blockchain technology can be used as a regulatory technology to achieve specific policy objectives. And so basically, and this relates to the talk from this morning, the idea is that we can potentially use technology to ensure regulatory compliance by promoting more transparency, auditability, or accountability in specific sectors. And the goal, of course, is not to codify or implement legal rules into a technological framework, but rather to translate those legal constraints into technological guarantees. And so the idea behind functional equivalence is to identify policy or regulatory objectives that motivated the creation of a particular set of regulations, and then looking at whether those same policy or regulatory objectives can be fulfilled with technical rather than legal means, in order to provide some kind of alternative form of compliance through technical instead of legal means. And so on a general level, so of course, is the idea of using blockchain technology as a digital audit trail to keep record of all the important transactions, so that auditors can later rely on this information without having to trust the company for the data it provides, because the company simply could not tamper with the data. And this is specifically useful, for instance, in the context of medical trials, where it is important on the one hand that we can verify that every step has been executed as prescribed by the law, but also on the other hand, to ensure that in case something goes wrong, no one has the power to retroactively go and modify the result from the test. And then more specifically to financial institutions, we also have seen how blockchain technology can be used to reduce the cost of regulatory compliance by increasing the transparency and accountability, for instance, with the proof of reserve mechanism devised by Kraken, which allows users to perform a cryptographically verified audits to certify that the cryptocurrency exchange actually has a full reserve, without, however, disclosing the account, the balance of the individual accounts, or, for instance, using built-in like multi-signature to ensure that funds cannot be spent without obtaining the prior authorization. And then another question related to the GDPR. So in spite of all the questions, indeed, that are raised about the potential conflict between blockchain technology and the right to be forgotten, there is also potentially the possibility of actually using blockchain technology to provide some type of verified credentials or attestation that could actually reduce the need for transnational data flows between different countries. And so instead of transferring data from one place to the other, then people can rely on those verified attestation to prove that they actually possess specific attributes. And this could create like new opportunities for trusted certification authorities to provide credentials to individuals from Europe member states in order to enable them to access services from outside of Europe without requiring them to disclose their personal data every time that they want to interact with a new service. And then finally, a question for you. So mostly for like all the research around zero knowledge proof, so there is a lot of discussion about the extent to which we can improve regulator compliance and actually prove that a particular company or entity has complied with particular regulation, but without disclosing any type of sensitive data. And I will be very curious if you have any idea of whether this is actually possible and how, or if you have any other idea about what kind of opportunities does blockchain provide to achieve specific regulatory objectives by relying on the technological guarantees that it provides.
I guess I'd be wondering what your view would be on a blockchain like Decred, where the voting mechanism and the method by which code is changed is baked into the blockchain itself. It seems like that is another attempt to realize a system which exists outside of existing legal frameworks, because there really is no throat choke if everybody on the blockchain is voting for every change in the code, and therefore if that code doesn't comply with real world law, there's really nobody to go after.
Yeah, I mean, it's a plutocracy as well, and but it's the same with like token voting or hashing power is the same. So unless you have like a particular entity that can decide, you basically just rely on how many people decide to go on one way or the other. And it's the same problem. You can have token-based decisions, and then people decide to change the protocol. But then if the miners do not want to change that protocol, they're still not going to change it. So you just have those different layers, but there is no coercion possible anyhow.
Can I add something? I think that blockchain does not, the problem is that it does not exist out of the legal framework. Basically, it has not its own legal framework, because even going back to what you were discussing before relating to DAO and any possibility for a court to decide to return money to which has been stolen, we have been at cases where already discussed in front of national court, as if it was in GT Marks, Japanese Court of Justice, deciding that after an attack, a cyber attack core to a blockchain platform based, they had to return somehow the money. So it was going back to what it was before. The fact is only that it was not within the blockchain system. So the idea is either we decide, and I don't know if I'm putting from the correct perspective, but at least it's something I can see from the legal one, is either we decide that we accept allocation of responsibility and accessibility point as it was before. So we go back to somehow a centralization where the states and new technologies are linked together, or we accept that from decentralization under the technology perspective, we arrive and we reach a decentralization of power. But to reach this point, we need they, within themselves, decide to how to behave. And in the end, we all people, human beings, has always felt the need to have a power center or someone who would guide them. So that's what I think.
This thing that seems very new that blockchains are doing, like forking all the time and letting the market decide, is something that actually human society is very familiar with. For instance, in things that are abstract. So one prime example is, for instance, religion, where people, people just sort of branch off, and sort of the market decides. Or another interesting thought is that maybe someday we'll also see blockchain merges as opposed to only having forks. That hasn't happened, I think. I don't know, has it happened?
I wouldn't know how you can merge two blockchains.
There are many mechanisms where you need agreement on both sides at like a certain date. They sort of converge, and there's maybe some exchange rate fixed or the market fixed, and then they sort of coexist. I mean, theoretically it could.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think there is nothing new about the forking, but the blockchain system actually provide more, it's like, as opposed to the open source forking, it's much more critical to actually fork on a blockchain because you have like the network effect that becomes really like, you can fork on an open source software and they are still interoperable. If you fork on a blockchain, then you lose the interoperability, you lose the value of the cryptocurrency and so forth. So I think it requires much more, like it's a much harder decision. But we're actually starting a seminar in Paris about blockchain using theological tools in order to analyze the governance of blockchain systems. Yeah. So, and yeah, if you want to hear more about this, you can read the book.
Let's thank the speaker and